You don't need me to tell you that a lot about church hasn't been ideal over the last year regarding our present circumstances. But while that's definitely the case, it is helpful to know as well that as we've been shaken out of some of our routines, we've been actually able to rediscover some things that we might have let slip before COVID, or maybe even have never done like that before. And even in the area of meeting together, which I guess is the area that we've had most difficulty in the last year, there are some ways in which the present state of affairs could actually drive us to do things just like the very first Christians did that we see in the Bible. Now, you see, we've got to remember that the early church was not some slick, organised operation. The first Christians, they did meet in public. We find this in Acts chapter 2, verse 46, where it says that every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. That's a public gathering. But that wasn't where the heart of their community life was. No, that was somewhere else. The verse goes on. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. Now, as we go into this next phase as a church, our raw church gatherings, it's not going to be exactly the same as it was for the very first Christians. But you know what? It can be pretty close. And for all the content we want to put out to help you over the next few weeks in your gatherings of sixes or two families, there's one element of those early church get-togethers that we definitely want to imitate and we want to encourage you towards, and that's what I want to do this morning. And I wonder if you noticed in that verse what they based their meetings, their get-togethers round. Well, it was the breaking of bread, the Lord's Supper, what we'd often call communion. Now, they did this originally not part of a planned service. They would do this as they ate a meal together, a bit like the way Jesus did it when he instituted the breaking of bread in the Last Supper with a meal with his disciples. And our encouragement to you all as the church, we would really want you to do the same, or try to do the same, as we meet together in homes over the next few weeks. The thing is, though, I know that breaking of bread can be really tricky. And for many of us, we find it hard to kind of do this thing that Christians have been doing for years and years and years, and has this weight to it over like a Sunday brunch with some friends. It seems to be, the two things seem to be very difficult to marry together. And so what I want to do is simply spell out in this video a few simple how-tos to help you to pluck up the courage to do this as you gather together with your friends from church over the next few weeks, and hopefully beyond that as well. I have 3 pieces of advice for you, and the first is this: come prepared. Now, there's this balance going on with communion. In a sense, Jesus just, as he was at the Last Supper, he just chose some things that were right in front of him. He said, here's the bread, that would have been at the table anyway. Here's the wine, that's just to his hand anyway. There's a spontaneity about it, and he grabbed those things and said, do this in remembrance of me. But of course, those things now, the bread and the wine, they would have such significance for us because of what they represent, that I think a measure of preparation is probably helpful in this whole thing. When I'm thinking of doing communion with friends, I would think of it in terms of what's ideal, what's okay, and then what's probably not okay. Let's start with the ideal. And again, this isn't the ideal for everyone, but this is probably where I would land, is I think actual red wine and a decent bread that you can physically break, I think that would be the ideal. You see, bread and wine is a very symbolic activity, and being able to actually break the bread as Jesus' body was broken, and drink a drink that actually resembles blood, both in colour and probably slightly in texture as well, that's powerful. You might want to go further and have nice glasses, or get a really, really nice loaf of bread. And you know what? I would veer onto that side of things. Ideally, I think that's really important. Going to such lengths adds value to the Lord's Supper, and therefore can, in our minds, it kind of gives value to what we're doing, doesn't it? So that would be for me my ideal. But I do recognise that sometimes that's just not practical for all sorts of reasons, and so I would often settle, and probably most of the time actually, for what's okay. And I would use then other substitutes that I have around in the house. And I personally think that drinking red squash and a slice of bread from the cupboard, you know what, I think that's absolutely fine. And I think Jesus would much prefer us to celebrate the Lord's Supper in this way than set our bar so high that we actually never do it in the first place. So there's an ideal and there's okay. But I guess there is a line for me which isn't okay. I think a glass of orange juice and like a half-eaten chocolate biscuit that you find lying around because you've forgotten to prepare anything, For me, I'd prefer not to do communion than to do that. I think it starts to take away the meaning from the whole thing completely. And I recommend against that. As while this is a down-to-earth and accessible meal, or a part of the meal, there is, of course, a seriousness about communion. And while we don't want to be overly formal, we definitely don't want to be too casual either. When I take communion, in the back of my head is Paul's warning from the passage in 1 Corinthians 11, 27 to 32, where he says, anyone who eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord unworthily is guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. Yikes. I just want to have that kind of to give me a little balance in this whole thing. So it's, in a sense, it's not just that anything goes here. Now, I'm not saying this, if you've done this before, it's not to make you feel bad. God's gracious, and he wants us to remember his death for us in lots of different ways. And he's not there with a big stick for us, It's our heart that matters. But I think we also want to do this properly in the future. So that's the first one, come prepared. Secondly, how do we do it though? Practical tips. Well, for me, if I'm doing communion in an informal home setting, I would do it either at the start or the end of a meal. I tend to do it actually practically at the start of a cold meal and the end if it's a hot meal. You might wonder why. Well, if you do it at the beginning of a hot meal, your food often goes cold by the time you finish communion, and nobody wants that, do they? Okay? And there may be different ways to do this then, and to do communion in either of those settings. And what I'm about to outline is not what you have to do, but I think sometimes a fallback plan or a default plan, if you're stuck with this, could be helpful. So if you're stuck and you've never done this before, you find this a little nerve-wracking, why not just try doing this, what I'm about to say? What I would do is at the beginning or the end of the meal, I'd get my Bible and I'd turn to 1 Corinthians 11, 23 to 26, and I would simply read it. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then I'd take the bread and I would break it, and in normal times I would hand it out. Obviously nowadays that might be not really what we do, and so I would probably give everyone their own piece of bread so that they can then do that themselves, avoiding germs, COVID, etc., etc. Then I'd give them half a minute or so just to encourage everyone, let's just spend time quietly thanking Jesus for his body that was broken for us. And once that's done, I'd keep reading, picking up in verse 25. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." And again, we would then spend 30 seconds or so reflecting on and thanking Jesus for his blood. Again, in normal times, we'd pass the cup round. You can quite easily give everyone a cup. That would be fine and would be totally appropriate. After all that, I'd either do one or both of two things. I might give an opportunity for anyone who would like to speak out their thanks or praise to Jesus for dying for us, or ask people if there's anything particular people would like prayer for, and then just very informally pray for each other, and then go about what we're doing for the rest of the day. So, come prepared, first one. Second, some practical tips about how to do it. But there's a third thing I want to say, and that's a question. What about the kids? Now, one reason people often don't do communion with friends is because the kids can be a little bit of a thorny question. We could ask all sorts of questions about the kids. At what age can a child take communion? How much do they need to understand about what Jesus did before they can do it? What if they can't act sensibly for the whole time and ruin the whole thing? Well, in a sense, I don't think we should get too hung up on these things. As I've said, communion is really important. It needs to be treated seriously. But it was Jesus himself who encouraged the little children to come to him. And actually, the symbolism of communion, I think, is incredibly simple for even a child to grasp. And you know what? It could be that communion itself helps children to grasp the seriousness of the cross. So, should you let your kids take communion? Well, in a sense, as parents, if you are a parent, that's completely up to you. But some guidelines we would use as a family would be these. Do they say they want to follow Jesus, even if that's understood in a childish way? I think that's quite an important question. Secondly, another important question would be, can they behave in a way that respects the seriousness of sharing in the blood and body of Jesus? For example, will they take it seriously? With our kids, once they seemed to get to an age where they could understand what it meant and say they wanted to follow Jesus, well, we would give them a clear opt-out here, so that choosing to take communion involved some degree of sacrifice for them. So, for example, at the end of the meal, we might say, well, you've got a choice. Either we're going to do communion together, me and your mum, and you can join us, or you can go and watch telly in the other room. Now, I don't know about your kids if you're a parent, but my kids quite enjoy watching telly in the other room. And so if they choose communion, it shows to a degree that they're really realising the seriousness of it and appreciating what it means. And if they don't want to do it, you know what? We wouldn't be disappointed with them or anything like that. That would be totally up to them. And we would then ask them the next time we did it. And actually, what we found is that communion is one of the things that has helped our kids most when it comes to appreciating that there is more to Christianity than just dancing around and children's games. We found that really helpful. I think they have too. So therefore, in conclusion, I've really enjoyed doing communion on Zoom with our community group over the last year. But I'll be honest, I am really looking forward to getting back to doing it in person as it was intended to be done in the first place. My encouragement would be to take this opportunity with both hands and not just to go around each other's houses for an online service and a chance to catch up, which is valuable on its own, but to break bread in each other's homes and eat together with glad and sincere hearts, just like the very first Christians did.